Hey, did you know that more than 90% of our viewers listen every night but haven't subscribed yet? If you enjoy these gangster sleep stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. It's completely free and helps us keep these underworld tales alive. Now, get comfortable, unwind, and drift into tonight's story. Welcome to the Silent Empires. Tonight, our story follows Nucky Johnson, the man who turned Atlantic City into his own empire. His story is one of ambition, control, and the price of power. Before we begin, like this video. We're aiming for 100 likes in this video. Share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. Your support motivates us to bring you even more fascinating stories from the underworld. Enoch Lewis Johnson was born on the 20th of January 1883 in the Smithville section of Galloway Township, not far from Atlantic City's Barrier Island. His father, Smith E. Johnson, worked in county law enforcement and later wore the sheriff's star. The family name carried weight in the courthouse at Mays Landing, long before the son earned a nickname. Young Enoch watched paperwork move budgets and saw how a signature could shift money more surely than any shovel. He learned early that government was not a distant thing but a daily presence. A neighbor that collected taxes, issued licenses, and hired men who knew whom to call when a window broke or a vote needed counting. He grew up in a flat landscape of creeks and plank roads, where the new resort across the bay sparkled with brass bands and holiday crowds each summer. Atlantic City had sold itself as a health haven and a stage for simple pleasures, and trains brought crowds from Philadelphia and New York to breathe the sea air. Behind those easy pleasures were hotel managers, railroad men, and party organizers, all of whom needed the county's goodwill. It was a place perfectly suited to someone who could translate favors into votes and votes into policy. Enoch Johnson learned to do both by watching, then by doing. He worked as a clerk, studied how budgets were assembled, and followed his father into the sheriff's orbit. In his early 20s, he became undersheriff, the right hand in a job that mixed courtroom procedure with the practical business of keeping order. It wasn't glamorous work. It meant learning jail rosters, bail schedules, patrol routes, and the delicate art of telling a powerful hotelier that a raid would come only if it had to. He developed a talent for being seen when it mattered, and absent when a meeting needed deniability. He had a calm voice, a ready smile, and a habit of listening long enough to make the other person feel wise. By 1908, he wore the star himself, elected sheriff of Atlantic County at an age when many men were still learning their trades. The badge gave him visibility, but the role opened doors beyond the courthouse. Atlantic County politics in those years revolved around a Republican machine built by Louis the Commodore Quainla, a hotelier whose empire of favors connected merchants and officials. Quainla had created a system that made the island wide open to pleasure while steering contracts and jobs to allies on the mainland. As sheriff, Johnson moved near the center of that system, and he observed how it functioned: disciplined precinct captains, ward leaders who delivered turnout, clerks and inspectors who understood which rules could stretch. The line between power and wrongdoing blurred in that world. Patronage was normal politics in many cities then, yet parts of it crossed the law. Ballots were coaxed, counted creatively, or harvested through pressure. Contracts for paving, water, and public works flowed to insiders who returned quiet percentages to the organization. Saloon keepers paid assessments for licenses and extra consideration to stay open late. Johnson didn't invent these practices. He learned them as routine, the price of a smoothly running resort, but absorbing them made him responsible for them. And over time, he became not only a beneficiary but a manager of those methods. In 1913, the machine suffered a blow. Quainla was convicted on corruption charges tied to the steering of city contracts and had to step back. The verdict did not end the organization. It created a vacancy at the top. Johnson, skilled at calm conversation and careful distance, moved into leadership. He did not take on a grand public title. Instead, he held party posts and county positions that allowed him to guide decisions without standing at a podium. He wasn't the mayor. He chose the mayor. He didn't paint a line on a budget. He told the painter where to hold the brush. Atlantic City's reputation as a playground didn't happen by accident. Johnson protected that brand by keeping the boardwalk bright and the newspapers mostly positive. He wanted families to see the parades and seaside air, conventioneers to find entertainment, and reformers to feel the city was safe enough to leave alone. Behind that image lay a practical arrangement. Certain blocks tolerated gambling rooms that exchanged chips in velvet-lined corners. Brothels operated out of the limelight, policed not to vanish but to avoid scandal. Saloon keepers and club owners paid fixed tribute, not to buy chaos but to buy predictability. Johnson assigned the police to keep order and prevent headlines. It was not a clean system, and it was not legal. Yet it aimed to keep violence minimal and tourist spending. The crimes under his watch were mostly about money and influence. Bribery, kickbacks on contracts, bid rigging, election manipulation, extortion through licensing, and the sale of official protection formed the core. He did not stand in a dock with a smoking gun. His crimes looked like envelopes passed in quiet rooms, votes tallied on ledgers that didn't match, and bank deposits that grew faster than any public salary could explain. He kept careful space between himself and direct criminal acts, insulated by lieutenants who collected funds from club owners and contractors who skimmed and shared. That insularity was a skill and a shield, though it would later fail him, yet he was never merely a taker. He understood how to return favors at scale, and that cemented his power. In winter, coal arrived at the homes of widows and veterans. At Thanksgiving, poor families received turkeys with silent notes attached. Hospital bills got paid with no publicity. Teachers found their paychecks on time even in tight months. If a house burned on a windy night, repairs followed with surprising speed. He distributed county jobs to loyalists, sure, but those jobs built roads and seawalls and cleaned the streets. The mix of public good and private gain blurred motives and built a web of obligation that reached into almost every neighborhood. He developed a personal style that made his authority feel effortless. He kept a suite at the Ritz-Carlton and turned it into an office where policy and theater mingled. He wore tailored suits, polished shoes, and the trademark flower in his lapel. The president of a railroad might be waiting outside his door at noon. By dusk, a bandleader might drop in to talk about a parade. Politicians visiting the resort for conventions took the elevator to his floor for a handshake and left with hotel rooms and a plan for evening entertainment. He cultivated a reputation for generosity and control. The man who could arrange anything. The man you didn't cross if you planned to do business on the island. In those pre-Prohibition years, his organization nudged state politics too. He handled delegates for party conventions, raised money for campaigns, and made sure the hospitality shown to visiting power brokers lived up to Atlantic City's promises. When the city staged big spectacles, grand parades, fireworks, the early pageants that would evolve into a national contest, Johnson's allies made sure the logistics ran perfectly. He installed loyal officials who were expected to do their jobs and deliver votes. He called judges and prosecutors to smooth disputes and protect the image of the resort. The expectation was clear. The town would remain open, orderly, and profitable. The list of laws bent in this period was long. Licenses appeared faster for friends. Health inspections overlooked minor violations in favored kitchens. Construction projects received approvals that would have taken months elsewhere. Election day saw friendly ward captains assist voters a little more than rules allowed. The flip side was equally real. Operators who refused to pay the going rate watched permits stall. A saloon out of favor might find itself inspected twice a week until its owner came around. People understood the language of consequences, and most preferred a quiet accommodation to a public fight they were unlikely to win. All the while, that red carnation moved through ballrooms and council meetings, a reminder that a single figure sat at the center. Johnson's gift was seeing how each piece, the cop on a beat, the contractor bidding on a bridge, the hotelier worried about a slow season, could be guided so that the city's image stayed bright and his organization stayed funded. He did not claim to be a moral force. He talked about business, tourism, jobs, and stability. By those lights he delivered. But the machine he ran trained people to break rules. And once a city learns to cut corners, the habit is hard to break. By 1919, the tide of national politics rolled toward a ban on alcohol, to a place like Atlantic City, famous for summer cocktails on verandas and lively night spots. The coming change looked like a storm on the horizon, and an opportunity wrapped inside it. Johnson had already built a structure that taxed illegal pleasures while dampening scandal. A federal ban on liquor threatened chaos if handled poorly. Yet it also promised immense profits for anyone who could guarantee supply and keep the island calm. He was not a distiller or a smuggler. but he knew people who were, and he controlled the local conditions that determined whether shipments arrived. Bars stayed open, and incidents stayed quiet. It is important to be precise. He did not stand on a dock unloading crates. His crimes involved arranging protection, setting prices for that protection, and ensuring the county's law enforcement balanced visibility with restraint. He was a political boss who monetized the public offices around him. That meant bribery in exchange for permits that should have been denied, extortion in the form of fees to stay open, graft on public contracts, and furthering election fraud that kept his allies in power. All of it violated the law, and all of it relied on a social compact. Let the town prosper, keep violence low, maintain a tourist-friendly face, and most people will look the other way. As summer crowds spilled out of trains and paraded beneath the boardwalk lights, Johnson perfected a policy he would later summarize simply: Atlantic City would be open as long as it stayed in hand. He presented vice as managed entertainment, not anarchy. He sat in rooms where hotel owners discussed occupancy rates and in back offices where ward captains whispered turnout numbers. Each handshake reinforced a system in which public duty and private advantage intertwined. The boy from the marshlands had become the arbiter of a coastal economy. He would soon be known far beyond New Jersey, because the country was about to outlaw the nation's favorite drink, and the man with the flower had already built the quiet machinery to sell permission where the law said no. Winter made the ocean sound like it was thinking. In January of 1920, a new rule settled over the country, and with it, one word acquired the force of a wall: Prohibition. Bottles that had been poured in the open were supposed to vanish. In Atlantic City, where visitors liked to raise a glass while listening to a dance band, that wall could have split the whole economy. Nucky Johnson looked at the coastline, at the trains hauling in crowds, at the hotels that depended on lively nights, and set out to keep the resort thriving, while federal law said the opposite. He didn't shout defiance. He did what he always did: organize people, put prices on permission, and insist that order come first. He had a clear philosophy. The island would be open, but it would be calm. Bars would move behind doors. Gambling would shift upstairs or down the block. Lives would go on without public brawls or headlines that scared families away. He met with police leaders, spoke to ward captains, sent trusted men to club owners. Payments would be regular, not arbitrary. Inspectors would appear on a schedule, not at random. If a federal team arrived, there would be cooperation on the surface and a quiet plan underneath to make sure the big picture stayed unchanged. It was wrong by the statute book. It was calculated by the ledger of a tourism town that could not afford to empty out every weekend. He did not smuggle cargo himself. Ships anchored offshore on what sailors called rum row, and fast boats darted between those floating warehouses and the inlets. Truckers moved crates under tarps through the marsh roads at night. Johnson's share came from granting room for that trade to function, and from the confidence businessmen had that deals made on the island would not collapse tomorrow. For that he took money. It shows up in ledger entries, in back of the envelope tallies, in the expensive lifestyle that outpaced any public paycheck he ever earned. His wrongdoing lived in those collections. The sale of official tolerance, the channeling of funds from illicit alcohol sales, the padlocked office door where envelopes stacked up before being distributed down the chain. Election days under his system bore his signature too. Turnout was never an accident. Ward leaders knew their lists and kept them current in ways that benefited the organization. Voters received rides, attention, sometimes pressure. Ballots were counted by people who owed their jobs to the party. The law defined one way of running an election. The machine had its own methods, honed over years of practice in many American cities. Johnson used those methods to deliver lopsided margins for candidates who supported his approach to governance. When the governor's office or a Senate seat hung in the balance, he made sure Atlantic County spoke loudly, and in return, those officials remembered him when appointments and contracts were at stake. He played the long game on image. He wanted photos of beaming families on the boardwalk in newspapers from Pittsburgh to Baltimore. He wanted conventions booked in every season, not just summer. In 1921, the city staged a beauty contest to extend the season past Labor Day, a pageant that would grow into a national institution. Johnson backed it not because he loved pageantry, but because spectacle meant hotel rooms filled, restaurants busy, and the island's name on front pages for pleasant reasons. Behind the scenes, Patrolmen directed crowds while detectives kept attention away from places where adults sought more discreet amusements. If a club broke his rules by sparking noise, attracting fights, or refusing to pay, it would find itself padlocked by dawn. He took money. He also enforced standards that kept profits flowing and tourists from feeling uneasy. The public contracts coming through the courthouse offered another stream. Roads across the marshes needed repairs, bridges needed reinforcement. A grand hall for conventions was being discussed long before it became brick. These projects were legitimate on their face, but inside the bidding process lived practices that were plainly illegal. Collusion among favored firms, kickbacks disguised as consulting fees, a cut returned to the organization for securing the award. Johnson didn't sign every document. He controlled who sat on boards, who set specifications, who reviewed bids. The practical effect was the same. He transformed public spending into patronage and revenue for the machine, smoothing the island's edges while taking a percentage for himself and his circle. Daily life in his orbit took on a routine. Mornings found him reading reports in his suite at the Ritz-Carlton, a flower in his lapel matching the varnished wood and shine of the room. Men arrived with folders. A saloon owner up Mulberry Alley had fallen behind. A contractor in Pleasantville wanted to talk about bids. A block captain needed a problem fixed with a stubborn inspector. He listened more than he spoke. He placed phone calls and made short notes that would send a chief to speak with a sergeant, a lawyer to whisper to a judge, a messenger to collect a payment and remind an operator to keep things quiet. A chauffeur took him along the boardwalk in the afternoon so he could wave, greet hotel managers by name, and be seen by visitors as the embodiment of welcoming order. He cultivated officials in Trenton and Washington as carefully as he cultivated caterers and band leaders. When Walter E. Edge ran for governor, Atlantic County's votes came in strong. Johnson had ensured it. Edge's rise helped him too. He needed state agencies to look kindly on the resort, to place conventions there, to fund improvements. He wanted federal officers assigned elsewhere when possible, and when that wasn't possible, he wanted relations to be civil enough that enforcement looked like a series of gestures rather than a campaign. He could not stop ambitious agents from staging raids. He could make sure those raids struck operators who had broken his rules or failed to keep a low profile. That dual-function punishment for internal discipline and theater for outsiders kept his system steady. The crimes he accumulated were acts of policy, dressed in power's clothing, bribery of police and inspectors, extortion of businesses through required payments to operate, racketeering in the sense of creating and profiting from a network that traded official tolerance for money, participation in bootlegging profits by taxing suppliers and sellers who used Atlantic City as a hub, conspiracy to manipulate elections by orchestrating turnout, suppressing opponents, and counting in favorable ways, abuse of office in the channeling of contracts. Each one had victims, though they were not always visible. Competitors out of favor lost bids. Honest saloon keepers who refused the system had to close. Voters saw outcomes decided before the polls opened. The public paid higher prices for roads and services because somebody had to replenish the skim. He liked to claim, when critics appeared, that he was a businessman keeping the resort alive. He would point to jobs in hotels, the pay envelopes in the hands of bellhops and stagehands, the families who enjoyed a week at the shore without worry. It was part truth and part excuse. A steady paycheck can dull outrage, and he counted on that. Yet even his defenders had to concede that he moved money from the shadows into his pocket and those of his allies. He was careful, but not transparent. He declared income as a public official. He did not report every dollar that came from licensing favors, contract percentages, or the sale of permission. For years, that imbalance went unchallenged. Then, bit by bit, oversight grew teeth. Inside the police force, his influence set expectations. Beat cops understood which doors to try and which doors to skip, which clubs to visit for a token inspection, and which to leave alone. A captain might quietly insist on wooden doors with peepholes instead of open bars, so if a federal team arrived, the transformation to respectability could happen in seconds. He forbade visible weapons in nightlife spaces, a rule that made trouble rare, and gave visiting operators from bigger cities a clear message. Earn money here, but don't bring the habits that cause headlines elsewhere. If an out-of-town figure pushed too hard, he found his welcome revoked. The island was not a battlefield, it was a business district, and Johnson acted as its manager. He had a sentimental streak that made him popular with people who never set foot in a nightclub. Charitable baskets showed up on porches. Hospital bills vanished for families who had no way to pay. Funeral costs were covered quietly. Those acts were not random. They were part of a deliberate web. A mother whose child received a winter coat would speak well of him in the grocery line. A veteran whose rent was settled would remember the favor on election day. The generosity was real and often heartfelt. It also functioned as political glue, keeping neighborhoods attached to a structure that otherwise might have looked cynical. The press mostly treated him as a colorful character, the man with the flower who could arrange bands for a parade on short notice. Local papers relied on hotel advertising and convention promotions. City Hall and the party organization were constant sources of tidbits. Harsh investigations did appear from time to time, especially in reform-minded outlets outside Atlantic County, but they rarely stuck. Johnson understood how publicity worked. He fed reporters stories about improvements, about safety, about parades and festivals. He invited editors to dinners, where the orchestra drowned out hard questions. It didn't silence every critic, yet it blunted momentum for campaigns that might have pressed harder on the legal contradictions behind the bright lights. By the middle of the decade, Atlantic City had turned Prohibition from a threat into a brand. Visitors told stories of never going thirsty by the sea, said without the specifics that would have made a prosecutor smile. Traffic from Rum Row sent a pulse through the island, and the machine's take grew. Johnson's life reflected it. His wardrobe was immaculate. His cufflinks gleamed. His car paused at curbs where children waved. He never swaggered. He didn't need to. His authority rested on the smooth functioning of a system people had come to treat as normal. He had allies beyond New Jersey who appreciated what he had built. The liquor trade required coordination among men, with very different temperaments. In May 1929, Atlantic City hosted a gathering that would become famous for the way it brought those men to one table. Figures from Chicago, New York, Philadelphia, and elsewhere arrived under the cover of a vacation by the sea. They took meetings in hotel suites, strolled the boardwalk in straw hats, posed for harmless photographs, and discussed matters that newspapers never printed: distribution routes, truce lines, prices, a general understanding that profits would grow if quarrels cooled. Johnson didn't dictate terms to those visitors. He wasn't their superior. He was the host and the hub, the man who could promise neutral ground, smooth logistics, and absolute discretion. That conference signaled how far his influence reached. He wasn't merely the boss of one county. He had become a facilitator in a national market that existed outside the law. Not everything in that bright picture ran his way. The same year, far from Atlantic City, markets cracked and then collapsed. The stock exchange trembled in October and fell in a way that changed the tone of the country. Vacations grew shorter. Some clubs struggled. Yet in hard times, people still sought diversion, maybe even more. The machine tightened its budgets without loosening its grip. Johnson continued to collect, continued to distribute protection, continued to steer contracts and votes. Federal interest in tax matters sharpened as Washington looked for revenue and examples. Income earned in shadows attracts attention when deficits widen. He could not know it yet, but the habits that had built his fortune and his image would draw the kind of scrutiny that no dinner, no parade, no flower in a lapel could deflect forever. He kept walking the boardwalk at dusk, greeting bell captains and aldermen, glad-handing conventioneers who arrived with brochures in their pockets. He maintained a code that separated business from spectacle, insisting that the island stay polished. His crimes remained the same in essence: conversion of public power into private income, orchestration of elections to preserve that power, monetization of vice with the promise of order. The scale grew with the decade, and with it, the balance he had to maintain grew trickier. The country was changing. Reformers found new tools. Washington took a closer look at taxes. He continued anyway, because momentum can feel like destiny when each day's routine delivers the same result: doors opening, budgets bending, parades appearing on time, bottles pouring where they were not supposed to pour. The crash came like a wave no one saw until it soaked their shoes. Orchestra leaders read bad headlines at breakfast, yet by night the boardwalk still shimmered. Visitors didn't stop arriving. They just counted bills more carefully and looked for places that felt worth the trip. Atlantic City understood showmanship as survival. Enoch Johnson understood it better than anyone. He monitored hotel occupancy as if it were a vital sign, asked bell captains about tips, pressed managers about bookings, took quiet note of payrolls in kitchens and laundry rooms. When the country's mood went gray, he doubled down on brightness. He kept the parade of distractions moving, not out of charity, but because a crowd with music in its ears forgets to ask how the machine behind it pays its debts. The great hall on the inlet side proved his approach. Years of talk became steel, trusses, and a soaring roof that looked like a promise made in rivets. Convention Hall opened as the decade turned, a symbol that the resort was more than beaches and vaudeville. Political parties met there, trade groups booked it. The pageant that had started as a late summer stunt moved indoors and looked grand under that curve. Johnson's hand rested on every step. He pushed county boards to approve bonds, lined up bids, oversaw change orders, and made sure the ribbon cutting glittered. The contracts tied to that project also fed his structure. Companies friendly to the organization saw specifications tailored to their strengths. Inspectors wrote punch lists that turned flexible when donors contributed. Skims appeared as consulting fees, as padded invoices, as retainers paid to lawyers who doubled as party officers. None of that showed up in brochures. It showed up in ledgers kept by men who understood they answered to the same suite at the Ritz. Prohibition still knitted the backside of the economy. Rumrow lay offshore like a night market. Launches buzzed in the dark, navigation lights covered with cloth. Pilots reading the marsh by smell and memory. Trucks rolled through the pines before dawn, canvas tight over crates labeled as canned goods. The system Johnson ran took money at predictable intervals from the bars, clubs, and bottle suppliers, then returned something for those fees. Stability, schedules, warnings when a raid loomed. A police lieutenant might recommend a new door with a buzzer. A sergeant might switch a patrol route for a week. A city inspector might visit, write a citation, then go quiet after the envelope arrived on time. That pattern was illegal. It also felt to many like the only way a resort that had sold evening pleasure for decades could keep its promise during a national dry spell. The man with the flower did more than bless bars. He built alliances that reached the State House. Governors came into office owing favors to counties that delivered margins. He turned Atlantic County into a bank of votes. Candidates who learned his language pitched jobs, roads, and appointments. He listened for honesty and for utility. If a person could be counted on to return calls, he had a place for that person. If a person went missing after the oath, that person found himself isolated. When a judge needed a mention, he arranged it. When a prosecutor seemed eager, he offered a seat at a banquet, then watched to see if curiosity softened. The crimes here were not cinematic. They were the daily conversions of public trust into leverage. A phone call that shifted a case's priority, a contract steered to repay a donation, a law written to suit the county's rhythms. He also groomed new faces who might carry his habits forward. Among them rose a young lawyer with a knack for retail politics, a man named Frank S. Farley, who would one day sit where Johnson Saturday. At first, Farley fetched votes and learned precinct maps. He watched how the machine set ticket slates, how canvassers knocked on doors, how invitations to clam bakes doubled as political tests. Johnson taught by example. He showed that a pleasant tone often gets more than a threat, but he never hid the fact that the threat existed. If a ward leader missed his quota, the ward leader's brother lost a job. If a hotel operator refused a contribution, a license stalled. Discipline didn't make the front page. Results did. Farley took notes, and the county stored them for the future. Reformers never stopped trying to pry the system open. Civic groups sent letters. Ministers preached against vice. Newspapers outside the county published exposés that portrayed the island as a place where the law was a polite suggestion. Johnson treated those stories as weather. He reminded allies to stay tidy, to keep fights out of the streets, to treat tourists well. If a brothel flouted his code by recruiting in public, padlocks followed. If a card room tolerated card sharps who preyed on visitors, cops paid sincere attention. That balanced profit without spectacle was his creed. It broke laws. It also protected the image that paid for everything else. The end of the dry decade proved how adaptable he was. When repeal arrived in 1933, a chain of illegal supply routes had to pivot to permits and distributors. Johnson moved quickly. Friends got the first licenses. Bars that had paid in secret now paid in the open to city clerks, and also paid quietly to the organization. He nudged state officials to look favorably on applications from proprietors who had played by his rules during the lean years. Beer trucks that had once taken back roads rolled down Atlantic Avenue with logos on the side. The money didn't stop. It changed lines in the ledger. He still collected assessments from businesses in exchange for inspections that ran on time and renewals that didn't vanish into a desk drawer. He still expected city workers to return a slice of their pay to the party treasury. He still used campaign contributions to blend politics, hospitality, and contracts into one self-reinforcing circle. Yet repeal also removed one curtain. With liquor legal again, the justification that he was only accommodating a national habit lost some of its force. Federal agencies had learned hard lessons during the Prohibition years. Treasury agents who had mastered the art of following money used those skills on targets who wore suits, not holsters. The principle established by the courts that income gained illegally is still taxable gave investigators a lever. They didn't need to prove who carried a crate. They needed to prove that a man's spending bore no relation to his declared salary. By the mid-1930 seconds, that lever turned slowly in his direction. Men from the intelligence unit listened to gossip in hotel lobbies, asked questions of bookkeepers who felt underpaid, collected canceled checks from suppliers, examined property records in county files that clerks believed were neutral. They counted his wardrobes, not the buttons but the invoices. They tallied the suite bills at the Ritz. They spoke with chauffeurs about trips to New York jewelers. They traced the down payments on a car that outshone a public executive's pay grade. Each bit alone proved little. The pattern felt louder. Inside city politics, he maintained control, though it wasn't as effortless as before. The Depression pushed more people toward patronage. That meant more hands out, more promises to juggle. It also meant the machine's charity grew even more visible. Coal deliveries multiplied each winter. Food baskets doubled. Hospital administrators found that beds opened for families connected to the organization. If a widow needed rent, someone appeared with a solution. Those acts were humane. They were also the mortar in a wall that held his voters. People defend the structure that pays for their groceries, even when they dislike how that structure funds itself. He kept courting national figures too. Senators liked a weekend where committees felt far away. Secretaries of state liked an easy stroll in sea air. Party officials liked a place where a problem became a dinner table full of seafood and a meeting that didn't feel like work. Johnson turned hospitality into influence. He arranged box seats, filled ballrooms, told band leaders which song to strike next when applause lagged. He also made sure that visiting power brokers noticed how clean the streets were, how safe the crowds felt, how quickly a lost child found a policeman. He called that good government, though critics said it was a polished surface over a corrupt foundation. While he smiled for guests, the tax case moved closer. The first tremors came as questions to his lawyers. Requests for explanations about bank deposits made in cash, for lists of gifts to relatives, for a breakdown of income streams beyond his public pay. The answers danced. The agents pressed. An operator, who had once paid the organization for tolerance, found himself in a separate jam and offered navigation help in exchange for leniency. A contractor with decades of receipts discovered that loyalty costs money when a subpoena arrives. People who had felt safe trading whispers suddenly worried about perjury. The machine had kept secrets by keeping everyone satisfied. Economic stress made some of those people self-interested in new ways. On the ground, police still took his signals. Patrols protected tourists first. Raids hit targets that made noise, or targets falling behind on obligations, or targets that could provide the right kind of theater when Washington sent observers. Quiet rooms with green felt survived. People who wanted a private drink got it. Yet the sense that time was changing crept over the island. Maybe it was the way outsiders talked about transparency now. Maybe it was the way federal tax prosecutions had landed harder in Chicago and New York. Maybe it was age. Johnson remained polished, but even he could feel that the country's appetite for boss rule had thinned. He used the tools he had always used to push back. He increased his involvement in statewide campaigns, reminded governors what his county's support had delivered, arranged for Atlantic City to host meetings that flattered officials who controlled budget lines. He reminded friendly legislators that the resort's taxes and jobs depended on a steady hand. He whispered that reformers would ruin the brand, and hurt working families. Some of those arguments still swayed people. Others sounded dated after years of headlines about kickbacks and contract padding in cities across the country. By 1938, whispers had become meetings in rooms he did not control. Treasury lawyers planned an indictment around the simple case they loved to bring. This is what you earned on paper. This is what you spent in public. This is the chasm between those lines. He could argue that friends picked up tabs, that gifts explained suits and cars, that parties cost him nothing because hotels comped his bills. The government could answer that gifts of that scale are income unless proven otherwise. He could insist that he was a political figure entertaining for the city's benefit. The agents could point to deposits that flowed to personal accounts and properties under his name. Summer crowds still came. Bands still played. The pageant crowned new winners beneath the stadium's arch. He kept the flower in his lapel and the schedule full. But the phone on his desk carried different weight now. Lawyers checked in daily. Accountants stacked folders higher. Allies asked careful questions in hallways. Every envelope became a risk. Every favor felt like a file folder on a stranger's desk, in a federal building somewhere upriver. When the indictment finally landed in 1939, it named tax years in the late 20s and early 30s, a period when his visible life had outpaced any salary he could list. The charge was clear. He had failed to report income that came from his control of the county's political structure, and from the sale of official protection to businesses that operated outside the law or at its edge. He pleaded not guilty. He walked out of the courthouse into a swarm of reporters, the carnation still pinned, the smile intact, the line ready about enemies who didn't understand how a resort survived hard times. Inside, he knew that this was not a raid he could stage or a story he could edit with a parade. The machine adjusted, as machines do. Loyalists kept the island humming. Farley, now more than a student, began to shoulder weight that Johnson could no longer carry openly. Contracts still moved. Inspectors still made choices. Atlantic City did not go dark, but the center of gravity shifted an inch, then another. A boss who had always stayed a step ahead of risk found himself operating in the oldest trap in American politics. The money you take to make a system work gets noticed by a government that can count. The trial ahead would be about arithmetic more than romance. The man who had made a career out of smooth hospitality would have to face the one audience that never drinks or dances. A jury with ledgers on the table and time to listen. The courtroom smelled faintly of varnish and fresh paper, the kind of clean odor that doesn't leave room for excuses. He arrived in a dark suit, flower in place, steps measured, the same man who had turned parades into policy for 2 decades. Reporters craned their necks. Locals who had shaken his hand at summer events now faced the novelty of seeing a familiar face at the defense table. The government's case was not about raids or rum runners or sensational headlines. It was about arithmetic. Agents had tallied his spending, noted his wardrobes and cars, counted hotel bills, traced deposits, and compared all of it to what a county official could admit on a tax return. The gap yawned. The story the prosecution told was simple. He took money for official tolerance and influence, then pretended the proceeds didn't exist when it was time to pay the treasury. The defense leaned on the habits of a hospitality town. They said rooms were comped, dinners were hosted by grateful hoteliers, friends lavished gifts on a man who had filled their hotels with conventioneers and kept the streets safe. They argued that the resort's most important concierge shouldn't be punished for being treated like a guest of honor. They insisted that the prosecution had mistaken an ecosystem of goodwill for an income stream. They emphasized what the case was not. It wasn't a bootlegging indictment. It wasn't a racketeering count. It didn't accuse him of loading crates on the beach or ordering violence. It said he owed taxes. The witnesses on the stand knew the island's back rooms. A former collector described envelopes and schedules. A contractor explained how bids seemed to bend toward firms that understood the percentage owed after the award. A city employee outlined payroll deductions that flowed to party coffers as a condition of employment. Bank tellers recounted cash deposits without clear origin. None of them presented an exploding moment. They offered repetition, a pattern of money that moved in an orderly way through the hands of men who answered to a suite overlooking the ocean. He listened without fidgeting. He conferred with attorneys in low tones. He carried himself as a public man hauled into a private dispute with the taxman. Yet the evidence felt heavy, and the country's new mood did not favor indulgence. The era that had allowed bosses to wave away allegations with a smile had faded. In 1941, the verdict landed. Guilty. The judge announced a prison term measured not in months, but in years, and attached a fine that matched the public's appetite for seeing a powerful figure pay. The flower stayed on his lapel when he walked out, but the smile had work to do. A boss depends on proximity. Prison removes it. He entered federal custody and went to a penitentiary known for steel discipline and long routines. The man who once directed a city's tempo now woke to bells he didn't control. Fellow inmates were people with encyclopedias of mistakes. A guard ran count. A clerk tracked commissary. The outside world shrank to mail, visiting hours, and newsprint that arrived without the boardwalk's shine. He read, wrote, kept to habits. He did not become a philosopher king. He stuck to order. He kept his suit sensibility in a place that demanded uniformity. He wasn't forgotten. Friends visited. Lawyers came with updates on appeals and on the finances necessary to settle tax liens and fines. His circle reorganized around someone who had studied his methods closely. A younger organizer named Frank S. Farley. Farley had started as a door-to-door vote-getter and grown into a lawmaker with a knack for counting noses and delivering results. He had a common touch, liked clam bakes, knew ward leaders, and understood that the machine's first promise, steady work and tidy streets, had to continue if power was to endure. While the boss served time, Farley made sure the resort stayed bright, the contracts moved, and the party slate came together every fall with no surprises. Power is never a single person. It is always a system. That truth protected the organization. Inspectors still knew when to be strict and when to be pragmatic. Contractors still bid with an eye toward pleasing the party treasury. Saloon licenses, now legal again post-repeal, still moved faster for friends. County employees still paid a portion of their wages back to the party fund, a practice that blurred the line between voluntary support and compulsory tribute. The system's old sins remained: bribery under polite names, kickbacks disguised as consulting work, bid collusion, pressure on voters, manipulation at the polls, and the sale of official tolerance for a price. The faces changed. The methods stayed largely intact. On the island, ordinary life intersected with national mobilization. In late 1941, war pressed into every corner of American life. Atlantic City's grand hotels turned into training facilities for young airmen and medics. Drill sergeants barked on carpet once walked by vacationing couples. The boardwalk heard marching cadence instead of vaudeville tunes. The machine adapted. War bond drives found generous sponsors. Politicians made patriotic speeches on stages built for pageants. The resort publicized its role in the war effort, and the organization that ran it wrapped itself in service to country. The man at Lewisburg read about it in newspapers and likely felt both proud and sidelined. His personal life shifted in a way that surprised people who thought they knew him. He had been widowed young before his ascent, and had remained a bachelor for decades while having companions who fit the city's show business culture. Around the time of the trial, he married a woman much younger, a showgirl who had come to the island with dreams, and found in him a caretaker with a talent for attention. She visited him inside, kept a life going outside, and learned the odd life of being Mrs. Johnson in a city that regarded him as a figure larger than any job title. The union did not alter his legal troubles, but it gave him an anchor beyond politics. The prison years lacked drama but had meaning. He saw, in a way he never could from a hotel suite, how laws apply when a man cannot choose the room, the chair, or the menu. He watched men adjust to routines that shrank them. He kept his own dignity. He did not write manifestos or pretend to be innocent in the grand sense. He focused on getting through the time. He was in his late 50s when he arrived, and past 60 when parole finally came into view. Good behavior mattered. The federal system honored it. Meanwhile, back home, Farley's star rose. He won office and then built a network that stretched through state agencies, commissions, and legislative committees. He learned to deliver budgets and make sure the county's share of state dollars never dwindled. He kept the organization's habits polished. No public ugliness, generosity at holidays, responsiveness when a voter had a problem with a permit or a bill. He walked the boardwalk as Johnson had and greeted bell captains and aldermen in the same cheerful tone. The party's club system, the dinners, raffles, clam bakes, door-to-door canvases, continued to turn Election Day into an exercise in choreography. The crimes behind the curtain remained familiar. Pressure on civil servants to donate, steering of contracts, selective enforcement of regulations, tolerance sold to favored nightlife operators, and calculated manipulation of turnout and tallying when the county's margin could swing a distant race. Investigators had not forgotten the machine simply because the boss was in prison. Taxmen still monitored filings, reformers still held meetings, churches still preached about civic virtue, but wartime urgency blunted some of that energy. People worked long shifts. Consciences allowed compromises. The resort kept its lanes swept and its propaganda tidy. If an establishment caused trouble, it was padlocked. If a club paid and kept quiet, it found the right inspector at the right time. If a contractor balked at paying a percentage, specs shifted and a rival firm won the award. The mechanics of corruption were careful. The absence of violence kept scandal low. The economy of accommodation thrived, and with it, the party treasury. Back at Lewisburg, parole officers evaluated him as they evaluated every inmate: conduct, compliance, the likelihood that he would enter stable employment and avoid further violations. He had no need to be told that he could never hold public office again. He wouldn't try. He would accept the reality that another man now managed the levers he once controlled. He would also have to face the embarrassment of starting again, without the legal authority that had once made strangers rush to open doors. He prepared himself for work that looked ordinary: sales, representation for companies in fields. He knew construction materials, infrastructure services, hospitality supplies, anything that used his personal network without crossing legal lines. When parole came, he walked out thinner, older, quieter. The boardwalk still smelled of salt and popcorn. The hotel lobbies still murmured in the afternoons. He could have stayed away, but he returned because he was inescapably tied to that stretch of wood and sea. People greeted him with warmth. Some addressed him as if nothing had changed. Others offered sympathy couched as jokes. He accepted both with good manners and avoided the meetings where slate decisions were made. Farley had that job now. The handover that began the day he was indicted was complete for good. He set about making a living without a public title. He became the man who knew people, not the man who placed them. He sold services and products to the same hotels and local authorities that once depended on his nod. He called buyers by their first names, remembered children's birthdays, made polite small talk, and closed deals by being gracious. He also kept doing what he had always done in private, helping individuals with small problems. A coal basket here, a hospital bill there, a rent envelope discreetly delivered. Not out of strategy now, at least not primarily, but because he had long ago decided that being the person who solved a neighbor's immediate need felt like purpose. The federal case had stripped him of money. To satisfy liens and penalties, assets were sold, accounts drained, habits resized. The suite in the Ritz was no longer an office. The car was more modest. Tailors saw him less often. If he missed glitter, he did not say so aloud. He had always enjoyed pageantry, but he had also prized control. Control now meant keeping his days tidy and his reputation, damaged as it was, decent enough that a hotel manager would pick up the phone when he called. People asked him, softly, what crimes he had truly committed. He could list them without embellishment, though he rarely did. He had taken bribes, calling them assessments. He had arranged kickbacks on public projects and called them consulting fees. He had extorted operators by tying licenses to contributions. He had steered contracts to favored firms in exchange for percentages. He had overseen routine election violations, pressure on voters, ballot handling that bent toward his slate, counts supervised by loyalists. He had shielded vice gambling rooms, brothels, speakeasies during the dry years by selling official tolerance for regular payments. He had conspired with ward leaders and police to keep that system steady, and, crucially, he had failed to report income from these practices to the federal government, committing tax evasion that the courts could prove even when other allegations remained matters of rumor or inference. That was the real ledger, the one that put him behind bars. In the years immediately after his release, he kept quiet about the old days. Reporters came around looking for colorful lines. He gave them pleasantries. He let them quote him about the sea air, about Atlantic City's charm, about the importance of giving visitors a good time. He did not tell stories about envelopes or midnight meetings. He did not claim martyrdom. He allowed history to take the shape of a legend around him while he went to work in a world where contracts were on letterhead and meetings happened in daylight. Farley's organization, now fully in charge, leaned into modernization. Roads were laid, bridges strengthened, hospital wings added, school roofs repaired. The state's budget sent funds down the shore like a tide, and the county kept them moving through projects that brought jobs and, inevitably, opportunities for percentage arrangements. Reformers pushed back from time to time. Commissions investigated. Grand juries asked questions. The machine answered with ribbon cuttings and smiling families. The old equation still worked. If a community looks like it is thriving, a certain number of people will accept the compromises that made it possible. He did not attend every ribbon cutting. He was a guest now, not an architect. Yet anyone who shook his hand knew they were greeting a man who had once run an entire coastal economy from a suite halfway up a hotel tower. He still liked good shoes. He still wore a flower. He still moved at a pace that communicated ease. Some nights he sat on a bench where the ocean sounded like a crowd at a distant stadium and thought about the years when a phone call from his room could alter a man's prospects. The law had recalibrated his life, but it had not rewritten the city he had shaped. When people asked how he had survived losing so much, he answered with a shrug and a line about doing the next thing in front of you. He knew, better than most, that power is a loan, not a possession. The loan had come due. He had paid with years and money and pride. He was still here, breathing the same salt air, buying coffee at the same counters, nodding to bellmen who had known him as a much younger man. The past did not vanish. It simply stopped answering to his commands. After the prison gate closed behind him, the first lungful of ocean air felt like a contract renewed on different terms. He was no longer the man whose phone calls settled everything. He was a neighbor who had to earn his way with pleasant talk, appointments kept, handshakes that ended in invoices instead of favors. The flower stayed in his lapel because it had become part of him, not because it meant he ran anything anymore. He found work in sales and representation, the kind of roles built on introductions and constant politeness. Hotels still needed supplies, municipalities still bought materials, convention planners still hired services. He called on buyers he had known for years, set meetings over coffee, listened more than he spoke, and left with signed orders when his charm met a practical need. He came home to a city that had reorganized itself without showing much strain. Frank S. Farley had taken the organization he had once led and given it a fresh voice. Farley wore a grin that played well at clam bakes and ward meetings, knew precinct captains by name, and understood the budget knots in Trenton's committees. He had learned from years at Johnson's side that power survives by solving everyday problems while keeping scandal scarce. Under Farley, the system's old habits carried on, cleaned up around the edges and fitted to a new era. Contracts still flowed to companies that understood the price of doing business with the county. Inspectors still timed their visits with an ear for who had been cooperative. Employees still felt pressure to donate to the party fund if they wanted to keep their jobs. Elections still looked orderly on the surface and choreographed underneath. The city stayed bright, and the visitors kept coming. Johnson moved around this landscape as a respected relic who knew where every road had once led. He never tried to elbow back to the head of the table. A felony conviction had made the choice for him, and age did the rest. He spent time with his wife, Florence, a former showgirl who had married him when his circumstances were at their stormiest. She had known him as the benevolent figure who could seat a party of 20 with a snap of his fingers. She learned to live with a man who now planned his week around client calls, and who took pride in an honest order book. They lived comfortably but not grandly. The suite high above the boardwalk was now a memory and a place he visited like any guest. He still received steady visitors. Old allies stopped by to catch up, some out of loyalty, some because asking for advice felt like paying homage. The counsel he offered was safer than the old days. Keep the streets clean, treat tourists kindly, be dependable. He didn't tell people to call a judge or nudge a contract. He understood that the era of casual tolerance had not vanished, but he also knew his signature no longer sheltered anyone. When reporters came looking for the colorful elder, he gave them polite lines about civic pride and the importance of treating the resort like a business that depends on goodwill. If a young journalist pushed him to talk about Prohibition, he turned it into a lesson about how cities survive national moods by minding their economies and avoiding fights they cannot win. There were still people who wanted him to confess colorfully. He would not oblige. He spoke about his crimes only in private. And even then, he kept it plain. He had taken money he shouldn't have taken, attached prices to approvals he should have granted on the merits, tolerated businesses that the law forbade, and profited from that tolerance. He had allowed supporters to turn public projects into revenue streams for the organization. He had demanded contributions from public servants and accepted them. He had helped shape elections so they favored his slate. He had then failed to tell the federal government the truth about how much money that system had given him. In court, arithmetic had caught up with him. After prison, he did not try to dress those facts as folklore. Atlantic City in the late 1940 seconds and 1950 seconds kept its old rhythm while waving a new flag. The hotels turned their wartime seriousness into peacetime celebration. The steel pier drew crowds for big bands and novelty acts. The boardwalk filled at dusk with families, conventioneers, and young couples on their first trip together. Some club rooms still offered back tables for quiet games. Bars now poured legally, which simplified a lot and complicated little. Inspectors focused on safety and licensing. The envelope culture didn't disappear, but it grew discreet. Farley's organization built roads, patched bridges, and made sure state grants arrived with regularity. Ribbon cuttings came often. Behind them, the familiar exchanges and expectations persisted out of sight. He watched all this from a distance close enough to smell the salt, but far enough to keep his conscience tidy. When friends slipped and tempted him with deals that felt a little too much like the old ways, he turned them down. He had learned the hardest way that proximity to power meant nothing when the government laid out bank ledgers in a courtroom. He needed no reminder that he could never again put his signature to a document that smacked of special favor. He could still use his voice to open a door for someone looking for a job or a room or an introduction, and he did, because helpfulness had been his language long before money ever changed hands. For all the talk of reform in the country, plenty of places continued to operate the way Atlantic County had in earlier decades. A Senate committee toured the nation during the early 50s to study organized vice and corruption. Televised hearings in other cities introduced Americans to a new kind of public accountability, one that turned shadow deals into primetime drama. New Jersey, with its mix of factory towns and shore resorts, drew attention too. The investigators peeked under rugs, issued subpoenas, and tried to map the line between entertainment and exploitation. The spotlight swung past Atlantic City more than once, and the county organization adjusted its posture accordingly. Cleaner books, stricter paper trails, fewer loose conversations. Johnson stayed out of those lights. He had become a cautionary tale for the very people who still admired him. A reminder that nothing remains secret when accountants and prosecutors decide to pull on threads. He made peace with smaller rooms. At luncheons, he sat in the middle of the table instead of at the head. Sometimes people stood and clapped anyway, because the past had its own charisma. He told stories that celebrated the city's endurance. The way hotels had turned themselves into training centers during the war, the way the pageant had grown from a seasonal extension into a staple that drew headlines every year, the way the Great Hall's arch still made visitors look up and feel they had arrived somewhere grand. He spoke about policy carefully, always emphasizing that good service to visitors was the town's heartbeat and that anything which threatened that pulse violence, disorder, open cheating should be shut down, even if shutting it down cost somebody he knew a little money. The city steadily modernized. Car travel changed arrival patterns. Families began to choose motels as often as old line hotels. Trenton sent down funds for new traffic arteries across the marshes, for flood control, for schools. Farley's reach into the state capital proved useful. Projects landed with regularity. With each project came an opportunity for the old machine's recurring sins. Bid rigging dressed up as tight specifications, percentage points skimmed as legal fees, quiet expectations that the winning firm would contribute to the party's campaign fund. It was illegal, and it was rationalized with the line that money helped keep the county clean and functioning. Johnson recognized the script. He no longer delivered the lines. He never lost the impulse for private charity. During cold months, coal and later heating oil showed up at doors that creaked in the wind. Hospital accounts got credited quietly for patients who had no plan for paying. If a widow's rent fell behind, an envelope found its way to the landlord's pocket. These acts had always been political knots tied in a sturdy rope. Now they were more purely human. He wanted to take care of neighbors, because it satisfied something in him that had never been about headlines. The record of his crimes would not soften because he bought a family 2 weeks of warmth, but the city he had made into a business would always be, at root, a community of shared winters and summers. People asked him about the boardwalk's legends, the big shows, the famous nights. The out-of-town names who had stepped off trains looked around and said this was the place to make deals. He confirmed details with a smile, but rarely added flourishes. He knew that memory can turn ordinary transactions into Hollywood scenes. The gathering of 1,929 had been a practical discussion pressed into myth by later tellers. He kept it in the realm of what it really was. A summit for smoothing distribution quarrels that would have hurt profits, hosted by a man who could guarantee neutral ground and decent catering. He refused to turn the unflattering parts of his history into romance, perhaps because doing so would have given comfort to a version of his younger self he no longer trusted. As time passed, the city's shape changed again. New resorts up and down the coast competed for the same families. Air travel shifted vacation habits. Some of the grand hotels showed their age. On certain streets, business thinned after dark. On others, new energy arrived in diners, bars, and goods that spoke to a younger crowd. The underlying political structure stayed familiar. Farley ran a disciplined organization that delivered state funds and kept regional projects moving. Investigations came and went, sometimes snapping at the party's heels, sometimes settling for a report that made City Hall a little more careful for a season. In that atmosphere, Johnson occupied a comfortable niche. The elder statesman who belonged to the old story, but did not intrude on the new one. He had never been a public speaker in the classic sense, yet sometimes he agreed to address civic clubs. Those afternoons carried a quiet theme: the difference between influence that helps a town thrive and influence that turns public offices into private cash boxes. He never pretended that he hadn't crossed that line. He explained, in his measured way, that the spirit of hospitality could excuse a great deal but not everything, and that the law had a claim on every dollar, no matter how tailored the suit that carried it. Listeners leaned in because few men can carry a sentence like, "I was wrong," with the authority of one who once treated the city as a property he managed. He kept in touch with allies who had stepped up while he was away. Farley remained gracious, never ostentatious about his control of the levers that used to be Johnson's. Others from the old days were gone, moved, or retired. The faces at the head table rotated. The orchestra changed tunes. He adjusted. His office now was a small desk, a phone, a list of clients, and a calendar. On good months, he hit his numbers and took his wife to a nice dinner. On slow months, he played cards with friends in kitchens where the only stakes were pride and pies. If anyone doubted that he had stayed out of trouble since release, they could check the record. There were no new indictments, no federal grand juries summoning him for testimony, no state commissions naming him among current fixers. He had been the man in the center of every favor worth a headline. Now he was a citizen who paid his bills and made sure his taxes were in order. The lesson the government had taught him was simple and permanent. When auditors decide to match your life to your forms, they will not be charmed by parades. As the 50s closed, he was a grandfather figure to a place he had once run like a chief executive. The boardwalk still suited him. He liked the way the boards thumped under feet, the way salt and sugar smelled together in early evening, the way the lights came on in strings. He met old friends for coffee at counters, where waitresses poured without asking. He swapped stories with bellmen who had been boys when he wore the badge. He bought papers from boys who had no idea the man with the flower had once made a governor's office shiver with a phone call. He sometimes thought about the families who had bent their lives around the machine he'd built, and the paydays it had promised them. A city may run on skim and tolerance for a while, but it also runs on trust, and he had tested that trust hard. Atlantic City had stayed alive through entertainment and optimism, canny budgeting, and the willingness of thousands to work long shifts for seasonal wages. His influence had been one part of that, and not always the healthiest part. He had benefited, and then he had fallen, and after that he had tried to be simply useful. The arc lacked glamour, but it fit the truth he once told a friend who worried about him. Sooner or later, every account must be balanced. In later interviews, when the subject turned to machines, he rejected the idea that the city could have prospered without a coordinating center. He argued that his system had kept violence down and commerce up. He acknowledged that he had taken more than his due. Listeners could decide whether that argument sounded like a defense or a regret. What mattered to him by then was smaller than history. It was the daily practice of doing his new job, keeping his calendar, paying for dinner, tipping fairly, writing notes to people who had lost someone, and sitting still enough at day's end to feel the wind come off the sea and think about nothing at all. From the outside, it looked like a gentle retirement lived in the middle of a working life. In fact, it was work of a different kind, maintaining dignity without command, presence without authority, and usefulness without leverage. The crimes that had defined his case were behind him, written in the record books and the memories of men who had handed over envelopes in rooms with drawn shades. The city that had made those crimes possible kept moving, partly because it was built to move, and partly because new operators had learned how to steer without drawing too much attention. He had become part of the scenery again, and that suited a man who now understood that the best thing a former boss can be for a city is a good neighbor. Television changed the sound of evenings. The big band era faded, living rooms lit up, and a country that once came to the shore for spectacle learned to watch spectacle on a screen. Atlantic City adjusted with its usual optimism. The pageant that had begun as a way to keep hotel beds filled after Labor Day now reached homes across the nation. A host held a smile for the camera, a crown flashed, applause rolled through Convention Hall, and the city's name ran as a banner under bright studio lights. Nucky Johnson watched the broadcast at home sometimes, smiling at a show he had helped plant long before anyone thought of cameras and sponsors. He took quiet pride in how a stunt had become a tradition, and how a hall of steel and arches had found a second life as a national stage. He kept his days practical. The phone on his desk connected him to buyers and clerks rather than aldermen and judges. He visited hotels with sample binders under his arm, talked about linens, equipment, paper stock, repair schedules, anything a property manager needed to keep guests content. He knew supply chains and personalities. He knew which deliveries earned goodwill and which delays could be forgiven only with a personal visit and a good line. Those conversations were his living now. He never pretended otherwise. When a handshake closed a sale, he thanked the buyer as if the favor ran the other way. The county's political life remained disciplined, though the names on the doors were different. Frank S. Hap. Farley became the figure who could pick up a phone in Trenton and hear nothing but yes. He won office, climbed committees, and learned how to convert a region's needs into lines itemized in a state budget. The methods that had defined the old machine still existed, shaped to a new era. Contractors who wanted the big jobs had to be generous to the party. Precinct captains still scheduled canvases with military care. Inspectors continued to interpret regulations with an ear for who cooperated. Elections arrived as pageants of normalcy that masked choreography underneath. The same old sins lingered in quieter forms. Bid rigging under neat paperwork, kickbacks disguised as fees, pressure on civil servants to donate, favors traded in back rooms where the talk stopped when a camera walked in. Johnson recognized each rhythm and kept his own steps away from them. He could not miss the country's new appetite for exposing what used to pass as clever. The Senate's televised hearings into organized vice pulled back curtains in city after city. Viewers watched stern questions lead to uncomfortable pauses. A roster of officials, gamblers, and middlemen explained themselves into corners. New Jersey found itself on the itinerary more than once, though the county's leadership avoided the worst kind of spotlight by keeping violence off the street and records tidy enough to pass quick inspections. The lesson for anyone who had ever lived by the old book was plain. The age of sealed rooms was over. You could not shrug off a subpoena the way you shrugged off a pushy reporter. He moved with that reality in mind. If an old ally hinted at a shortcut, he smiled and changed the subject. If a club operator, remembering the old days, tried to swing a friendly deal, he warned the man that nothing stayed secret when auditors compared deposits with invoices. He paid his taxes without drama. He filed carefully. He left no doubt. He had learned, years earlier, that arithmetic cares little for legend. The city came into the mid-950 seconds with new roads feeding it. A north-south parkway gave travelers a smoother line along the coast. Soon an expressway would slice through pine stands and farms from the west, turning the long ride from Philadelphia into something a family could imagine after breakfast. Farley and his allies had pushed hard for those links, framing them as lifelines for a resort that had to compete with car culture and weekend whims. The projects carried ribbon cuttings and, behind those ceremonies, the usual temptations, specifications that pointed to certain firms, contributions woven into award season, percentages that found their way back to party accounts under dignified names. The criminal shape had not changed: collusion, skims, transactional licensing, and a machine's share of wage envelopes. The city's polish simply made those acts harder to spot. He remained a figure people wanted at a table. When he entered a luncheon, heads tilted with the reflex that greets a familiar song. The flower at his lapel still drew comments. Newcomers had heard legends and looked for the man inside them. He deflected attention by talking about shore breezes, the value of a clean sidewalk, the way a good front desk clerk could save a guest's whole trip. He didn't varnish the past. If pressed privately, he called his crimes by their names. Bribery cloaked as assessments, kickbacks on public work disguised as fees, extortion through licensing, election manipulation achieved with pressure and control of the count, official protection sold to places that offered gambling behind closed doors, and to houses that sold adult company, the collection of party donations from public pay envelopes, and a record of tax returns that once failed to account for income from all those practices. He said it plainly. He didn't add flourishes. He had no interest in theatrics that excuse behavior with charm. The steel pier offered fresh distractions every summer, but the resort could feel the pull of competition. Air travel sent families to distant beaches. A desert city across the continent found its own way to mix hotels with gambling, this time under state law rather than nightly tolerance. Atlantic City answered by doubling down on conventions, on the promise that a company or a party could hold a meeting here and find the service impeccable. The big hall, built under his watch, proved its worth again and again. Trade groups filled the seating with product demonstrations and banquet tables. Political organizations planned their calendar around the hall's availability. The city's hospitality industry treated each booking as a test it could not afford to fail. He loved walking through the concourse when a national event came to town. He shook hands with delegates in matching hats, made a point to greet caterers hustling trays, and watched security lines with a veteran's critical eye. In 1964, a national party rolled in with banners, bands, and a hard argument tearing at its own seams. The convention's drama had little to do with the boardwalk its center, lay in a fight over representation from the Deep South, but the island absorbed all the cameras, speeches, and late-night caucuses. Johnson moved like any proud citizen would, pointing out the hall's curves to anyone who'd listen, happy that the scene by the sea remained part of the country's civic theater. He also recognized that the city he had once called open was now open in a different way, open to national scrutiny with microphones wired to living rooms. Age tugged at him, gently at first. He shortened his afternoon strolls. He saved his voice for calls that mattered. He preferred a booth near a window in quieter restaurants. Friends noticed he had lost a little weight. He laughed it off. He had appointments to keep and a ledger to balance. He enjoyed the small satisfactions of a salesman's life. A month that landed above target. A manager who renewed a contract because deliveries were always on time. A new hotel that placed an order on the strength of introductions he made without asking for anything except the chance to earn the business. He once engineered budgets measured in millions. Now he counted his commissions with care and took pride in the honesty of small wins. The structure he had built in his prime did not collapse when he left it. It matured. Farley ran it like a utility. Reliable. Silent. Everywhere. That steadiness helped the county weather years that were kind to some shore towns and difficult for others. With steadiness came complacency. Corruption thrives in quiet. The same patterns that had once fed Johnson's organization fed Farley's, even as the legal lines were drawn more clearly and the paper trails were kept more orderly. The abuses remained familiar to anyone paying attention. Firms chosen before bids were posted, inspectors whose zeal varied with a proprietor's generosity, precinct captains who still assisted voters a little more than rules allowed, county jobs that required party loyalty as an unwritten clause. He did what he could to push the young away from easy cynicism. When a nephew or a neighbor's kid asked for advice, he told them to treat public office like a trust and private work like a craft. He said the same line often: "The fastest way is not always the best way, And the cheapest way can be the most expensive when a grand jury meets. He had earned the right to be blunt by paying dearly for shortcuts. That gave his advice gravity. Some took it. Others smiled and hoped he was talking about a world that had passed. The world had not passed. It had simply learned to be more careful. He kept up his small, unfussy charities. He paid a month's rent for a widow he barely knew. He sent money for a student's textbook bill when an old friend asked on behalf of a niece. He handed a mechanic cash to cover a repair he suspected had been underpriced out of kindness. He had always admired competence in unnoticed jobs. The nurse on a night shift, the janitor who made a lobby gleam, the city worker who knew the storm drains well enough to predict which corner would flood. Quiet gifts to those people pleased him more than box seats ever had. Reporters who specialized in nostalgia found him late in the decade and asked about the days when a boss's word cleaned the streets after a summer storm and filled the hotels by July 4th. He offered stories about parades that materialized without a hitch, about the logistics that made 1,000 turkeys appear on doorsteps in a single morning, about how he once ordered the police to carry their kindness as conspicuously as their badges during conventions, so visitors would leave with a good word for the town. He did not let them turn vice into romance. He refused to gild the realities of protection money and rigged bids. If a writer tried to say it all felt harmless, he stopped them with the kind of look that says we both know better. He was not a moralist. He was a man who had seen how profitable it could be to treat laws as suggestions, and how costly it could be to do so in a country that kept learning how to trace money. The record of his wrongdoing would never shrink. The core remained what it had always been. He built a machine that monetized public authority by selling access, tolerance, and advantage. He shaped elections to keep that machine in place. He sheltered illicit gambling rooms because they paid to be sheltered. He allowed houses that sold adult company to operate in quiet zones because their owners paid for official silence. He required city employees to return a slice of wages to the party. He took percentages from public works. He then filed returns that pretended a politician's salary covered a life filled with bespoke suits, fine dinners, and a suite that served as an unofficial city hall. The law eventually forced a reckoning. He served his sentence. He came back and kept to legal lanes. Atlantic City's pulse changed as the 60s moved on. The motels at the city's edge drew families who liked easier parking and simpler meals. Some grand hotels aged faster than managers preferred. Famous rooms went dim. A few blocks off the boardwalk, storefronts struggled. Neighborhoods shifted. New music styles filled dance floors elsewhere. The resort never lost its purpose, but it no longer felt like the center of every summer. The machine stayed efficient, yet its power couldn't alter the deeper currents: airlines, television, the rise of other destinations. Johnson took these changes with equanimity. He had once shaped the city's image. He now watched it fight for another version of itself. Old age made him reflective but not gloomy. He kept rituals: coffee in the morning, a walk if the wind cooperated, a check-in with a client, a phone call with a friend who needed a ride to a doctor. He liked to stop on a bench and watch the ocean throw itself at the beach, each wave arriving as if it were the first. He knew that men like him are often remembered for the most lurid line in a prosecutor's closing argument. He accepted it. He hoped that anyone reading farther might see the longer picture. A county lifted and distorted by a machine that delivered services and also drained integrity. A city kept orderly and also trained to excuse too much for too long. A leader who balanced spectacle and stability until the math came due. He made it a point to look in on the hall he had helped bring to life whenever a major gathering ended. He would stand under the arch as a crew swept up confetti, as lights cooled, as electricians coiled cords, and he would feel the old satisfaction of having built a stage where a town could sell itself to the world. He no longer had a claim on who stood on that stage. That was fine. He had lived long enough to know that permanence is a superstition in public life. The best any builder can hope for is a structure that outlasts an era and gives the next group a chance to do their jobs. He did not pretend that leaving office meant leaving influence. People still sought him out when they faced knotted problems, if only because age itself can be a credential. His answers were simpler now than they had ever been. Follow the law. Pay your bills. Be generous. Keep the streets clean. Book entertainment families can enjoy. Don't confuse attention with success. They were not the words of a boss. They were the words of a citizen who had traveled far from the center of the circle he once drew around himself. and discovered that a smaller circle suits a life just as well. In these years, he also saw the city try to imagine a bigger leap. Some locals whispered about legalizing games of chance as a formal industry, not a tolerated side business. It was talk, not a campaign yet. He listened without committing to a position. He understood better than anyone the difference between a wink and a law, between a rule bent each night and a statute passed in the light. He told friends that whatever the city chose, it should choose plainly, because ambiguity feeds a kind of rot that is hard to cure once it runs in the wiring of a place. When the day's work ended, he walked home through streets he had known since horse-drawn carriages rattled past soft sand. He watched new cars nose into angled parking spots, teenagers drift past with radios pressed to their ears, old friends link arms against a sudden gust. Time had sanded the edges off his legend without erasing it. He had been many things: sheriff, broker, host, boss, inmate, salesman, neighbor. He had broken laws and kept an island orderly at the same time. Two truths that do not cancel each other but must be written side by side. He had learned late that a long life gives you the chance to try again in a smaller way. He took that chance, day after day, under the same salt air that had accompanied every choice he ever made. By the late 60s, the light along the boardwalk had a softer hue. Neon still hummed. Salt still rode the wind. But the crowds had changed their habits. Families arrived by car, stayed a night or two, then drove on to other beaches or parks. Television had turned living rooms into theaters. Airlines ferried travelers to farther shores. Nucky Johnson woke early anyway, folded the newspaper just so, and kept appointments written in his careful hand. He liked the feel of a day planned to the minute, even if the minutes no longer bent cities to his will. He and Florence lived on the mainland, a few turns from the causeway, in a house that looked out on trees rather than surf. Their life was ordinary by design. He made calls to hotel managers, to purchasing clerks, to municipal buyers who needed supplies. He met customers with samples in a leather case and a smile that had opened doors long before it ever closed a sale. He kept his talk friendly, his promises modest, his paperwork exact. Years earlier, he had run a county from a suite. Now he ran his week from a small desk and a phone that could go quiet for an hour without causing him worry. That quiet felt like grace. Atlantic City's political life remained orderly under Frank S. Hap Farley, who had learned his art at Johnson's elbow and then refined it to suit a new era. Farley steered budgets in Trenton, brought home road money, and turned state commissions into engines that benefited the county. The machine that once bore Nucky's fingerprints still handled contracts, permits, and campaigns with mechanical precision. The old practices persisted in updated form. Favoritism in awarding public work, contributions that greased a bid's path. Inspectors whose zeal waxed and waned according to a proprietor's cooperation, and an election day that looked like civics class from the curb, while precinct captains choreographed the inside game. The same conduct that had drawn federal attention years earlier: kickbacks, bribery, pressure on public employees, tolerance sold to certain nightlife operators now wore tidier clothes. Johnson watched it with a mixture of recognition and distance. He did not interfere. He also did not pretend it was gone. He had become a man people sought out for perspective rather than permission. When young council hopefuls asked what made the town thrive, he talked about basics: clean streets, attentive police, prompt trash pickup, a friendly front desk at every hotel. When a precinct captain wanted to reminisce about the old swing, he smiled and steered the talk back to voter service rides to the polls for seniors, flyers that actually answered questions, poll workers trained to avoid quarrels. He never instructed anyone to call a judge or tilt a bid. Those plays belonged to another lifetime and had cost him dearly. He had no appetite for shortcuts that ended in ledgers under fluorescent lights. Reporters continued to knock, especially those who wrote feature pieces about a bygone resort. He gave them the same steady answers. He had built a system that monetized public authority. He had taken bribes dressed up as assessments, skimmed from public works through friendly contractors, tied licenses to payments, protected gambling rooms and houses that sold adult company in exchange for regular fees, leaned on public employees for a slice of their wages, organized ballot handling that favored his slate, and then filed tax returns that pretended those streams didn't exist. The courts had called it what it was. He had served his sentence. He had started over. He let that be the shape of the story. If a writer hoped for romance, he offered civics instead. New infrastructure remapped arrival routes in those years. The Parkway had opened the coast. The Expressway, finished in the mid-60s, shortened the ride from the west and made weekend trips feasible for families who, in earlier decades, would have stayed home. Farley had championed those lanes, and ribbon cuttings lined up like pearls on a string. Big projects brought familiar temptations. Specifications sometimes read like invitations to a particular firm. Party treasurers knew which week of the calendar would be most conducive to generosity. Oversight tightened compared to the 20s and 30s. But human nature and habit do not vanish with a new form. Johnson recognized the pattern but kept his advice to kindness and competence. The big hall by the inlet remained a point of civic pride. Trade groups booked its floor, orchestras filled it, and a national political convention electrified it in 1964. Delegations in straw hats marched, bands blared, and cameras turned the hall into a living postcard. The country argued with itself under that arch about representation and principle. Johnson, now an elder, walked the concourses, shook hands with ushers and cooks, and told anyone who asked that a town must always be ready to host the nation with grace. He felt the cameras in a new way. In his prime, a boss managed the visible and the invisible with equal confidence. In this era, the invisible had shrunk. Microphones found everything. He took satisfaction in the thought that the stage he helped build had become a forum where the country worked out its business without backrooms. Day-to-day life had simple pleasures now. He liked coffee at counters where the waitress poured as soon as he sat down. He liked crossing paths with bellmen who had once called him Mr. Johnson with a mixture of awe and affection, and now greeted him with an easy familiarity that comes only when titles drop away. He liked calling an old friend to arrange a ride to a doctor and being the one behind the wheel an hour later. He liked being useful without being in charge. His private generosity stayed steady. A winter bill for oil got covered for a widow who didn't know who had made the call. A hospital ledger showed a credit next to a name that had kept a house neat for decades on pay that never went far enough. A kid from a quiet block found money for books in an envelope that came with no lecture. He had always understood that small, targeted help builds loyalty in a way large gestures rarely do. In these years, he liked that such acts had no political calculus attached. They pleased him because they eased a day for someone who needed it. Health tugged on him gently at first. He was in his 80s, and age makes basic tasks deliberate. He trimmed his walks, favored benches with sun on them, and held railings on staircases he once mounted two at a time. He denied nothing. Friends saw him leave a luncheon early and understood. He saved his voice for afternoons, when a client needed convincing. He kept medical appointments without complaint, listened to doctors who used words like rest and pace, and followed instructions as if they were orders from a captain he respected. He remained a figure of local consensus. People who had opposed him in his heyday now nodded to him with a respect that sounded like peace. They had fought his machine because it bent rules. They acknowledged that he had kept the place orderly and prosperous. He answered that both things were true, and that he had erred in treating law as a menu rather than a standard. The line came easily, perhaps because he had carried it in his pocket for years. A town can forgive a lot when a man talks plainly. The resort's economy evolved in ways even a skilled organizer couldn't reverse. Motels at the edge of town drew travelers who preferred parking by their door. Some grand hotels grew tired despite faithful maintenance. New music and new scenes flourished elsewhere. A desert city in Nevada, where gaming was legal, began to pull the kind of performers and publicity the shore once took for granted. Locals started to talk about changing the state's rules, not just its nightly tolerance. Johnson listened without taking a stand. He knew better than anyone the difference between look the other way and a statute written in daylight. He told friends that whatever came next should be honest and open, because ambiguity breeds rot. He made that point quietly at dinners where people still leaned in when he spoke, even if he was no longer the one who decided what happened next. Historians and students sometimes asked to sit with him. They brought legal pads and questions. They tried to separate myth from fact. He helped. He explained that the word boss covered a lot of terrain, a phone tree that reached every ward, a fundraising system that mixed picnics with pay envelopes. an apparatus for smoothing a tourist's visit that also smoothed the contractor's percentage, a promise to keep violence low so families returned next season. He never dressed those realities as chivalry. He described them as a set of choices made in a particular economy. He added the sentence that still mattered most to him. The law is not a suggestion, and income is income, even when it's counted in cash in a back office. Arithmetic is undefeated. He had two pockets of regret he spoke about only with close friends. The first was the habit of turning public jobs into party assets. It kept the machine strong and voters content, but it trained too many people to see government as a club rather than a trust. The second was the way tolerance for private vice, even when managed, dulled a town's reflex to enforce rules fairly. He believed that Atlantic City's hospitality could have been protected with stricter lines. He believed that, and he knew he hadn't always acted like it. Saying so out loud felt like a necessary ledger entry. He still enjoyed spectacle when it was clean. He attended pageant nights, not every year, but often enough to feel part of a tradition that had outlived its creators. He took Florence to shows at the Steel Pier, applauded when the orchestra found an old tune, and complimented staff who made crowds move smoothly. He liked watching a seasoned manager coordinate ushers with a nod, the same way he once signaled ward captains with a glance. Competence still delighted him. Financially, he stayed afloat without drama. He wasn't rich. Prison and penalties had emptied accounts and forced sales. He didn't brood about it. He managed expenses, paid taxes on time, and took quiet pleasure in a ledger with no red ink. His car was comfortable without being ostentatious. His wardrobe remained neat, the flowers still in the lapel because it had become a signature he wasn't ready to retire. If strangers took it as a flourish, that was fine. To him it was a habit and a memory. By 1967, he moved a little more slowly, like a man aware that each step deserves respect. Friends took turns driving him when weather ran rough. He reciprocated by becoming a steady visitor at hospital rooms and living rooms where illness had posted itself. He told stories that made people forget their aches for 15 minutes. He had a gift for that something practiced when he had worked the entire boardwalk as a single room, later turned into a way of easing a neighbor's afternoon. Public life, even respectful public life, can be draining. He began to decline invitations he once accepted as a matter of course. He went to fewer dinners, skipped evening events, stuck to lunches and coffees. He reserved energy for Florence, for a short list of clients who relied on him, and for the errands that make a house run. He liked visiting a hardware store and talking with the proprietor about faucets and paint. He liked the feeling of being an ordinary customer whose presence didn't set off whispers. He couldn't help being recognized, though. The town was in his bones, and the town had a long memory. A bell captain would point him out to a trainee. An alderman would cross a lobby to shake his hand. A clerk would set aside a newspaper with the crossword untouched, because she knew he liked to work it at lunch. Those small courtesies added up to something that felt like forgiveness, even if that wasn't the intention. They let him be both what he had been and what he had become. He thought often about balance sheets, not only the ones auditors keep. He tallied decisions that had benefited families and businesses. He tallied harms done in the name of efficiency and order. He knew those columns don't cancel each other. They sit side by side. The city had prospered under a system he built. It had also absorbed habits that took years to unlearn. He accepted that, like a contractor who looks at a finished building and sees both its strengths and its compromises. Through it all, the ocean kept doing its work. He liked to end afternoons near the water, even in winter, bundled against the wind, content to hear the surf push and pull with a patience time can't alter. On certain days, the air tasted like early years, salt, coal smoke, popcorn, and he smiled at the trick. On others, it smelled like rain, and he hurried home, careful on wet boards, remembering a younger stride and feeling no shame in the change. In early 1968, he began to spend more time at home, at ease in an armchair, with a radio nearby. He followed local news, checked the weather, took calls from friends and nephews, and kept his calendar as full as strength allowed. Doctors suggested a spell at a convalescent facility where nurses could keep an eye on him while he regained energy. He agreed without drama, packed neatly, and treated the move as a practical step. He had always liked professionals who know their jobs. He liked them even more now. He never stopped thinking about the city across the water. He asked visitors how the boardwalk looked that week, which hotels seemed busy, whether the hall had bookings through the fall, what the talk was in Trenton about big projects. He listened with the attention of a man who had once turned those details into a living, and who now took joy simply in hearing that the show went on. He didn't need to steer it anymore. He only needed to know it was still moving, still finding ways to please strangers who arrived with sand in their shoes and left with stories about a place that managed to balance fun and safety with uncommon skill. He had lived through cycles: boom, crackdown, recovery, reinvention, and he had learned their tempos. He knew another cycle was coming, because that's how cities survive. Whether it would involve new laws or new industries wasn't clear yet, but the whispers had started. He nodded when friends mentioned them, and told them what he told everyone at that stage. Be straightforward. Be careful with money that isn't yours. And remember that a tourist town survives on trust more than on glitter. It was advice born of practice and paid for at a high rate. The winter light softened early. The boards cooled quickly at dusk. He watched the evening settle from a window and let the sound of the surf travel across the marsh as if it were a familiar voice. He had been a sheriff, a broker, a host, a boss, a defendant, a prisoner, a salesman, a neighbor. He had broken laws and kept streets safe. Two facts that had to be read together to understand the whole. Time had taken the edges off his legend without erasing it. He could feel part of a story that would outlast him, made up of parades, budgets, envelopes, courtrooms, and a hall where the country came to argue under a roof he had helped raise. He waited, patient now in ways he had never been, when the phone at the Ritz rang all day, ready for whatever the tide brought next. Morning at the convalescent home began with the soft clink of cups and the whisper of wheels on polished floors. He greeted the nurses by name, made a point to thank the aide who opened the curtains, and asked for the local paper as if the day could not make sense without it. Friends came in twos and threes. A retired bell captain brought bakery boxes and stories about crowded weekends. A former precinct captain arrived with fruit and left with a laugh because the old boss could still tell a joke like he was smoothing a room. Frank S. Farley visited when his calendar allowed, sitting close, updating him on contracts, road work, and the steady business of keeping a county's pulse regular. They didn't dwell on the past. They spoke about bookings for the big hall, hotel occupancy, and whether the expressway had eased Saturday traffic as much as planners promised. He stayed sharp. He asked for exact numbers, wanted to know if tax receipts matched projections, wondered whether inspectors had adjusted to new safety rules for hotels with aging wiring. His questions came from habit and affection. The town had been his work for so long that asking about its details felt like asking after a child. He avoided the language of command. Advice came gently now. Make the welcome unmistakable at the train station. Keep patrols friendly and visible at dusk. Treat the off-season as a chance to fix what summer crowds hide. These were the notes of a man who had learned what lasts in a resort town. Courtesy, speed, cleanliness, consistency. Reporters tracked him down even here. They wanted color, a neat line that turned a long career into a pocket tale. He gave them time within reason, though he insisted on accuracy. When a young writer tried to paint his Prohibition years as a romantic caper, he pushed back. He explained that the crimes were the same wherever a boss lived. Money for influence, money for tolerance, money for engineering election outcomes, money for steering public contracts. He told the truth in simple clauses. He had overseen the collection of payments from clubs and suppliers to ensure police left them alone if they kept quiet. He had arranged for contractors to return a percentage of public work. He had expected donations from public employees paid by the county payroll. He had approved licensing as a transaction, not a neutral process. He had allowed discreet gambling rooms and houses for adult company to operate behind closed doors in exchange for fees and compliance with his rules about order. He had then filed tax returns that pretended none of that revenue existed. That ledger, more than any raid, had sent him to a federal prison. He did not soften those sentences. He also reminded them that he had kept violence scarce and made a bargain with the city's conscience. Entertainment without chaos, shows without blood, indulgence without fear, for the family walking past at dusk. The staff learned that he enjoyed small routines. He liked the radio at low volume during baseball season. He liked a clean shave early, not mid-morning. He liked a seat by the window on days when the marsh grass blinked green, because the sight connected him to the roads that led to the island. He liked writing notes to people who had sent him holiday cards decades in a row. He thanked them for their patience and kept their addresses current, the way a man keeps the index of his life in order. Even reduced to a quiet room and a set of pills on a tray, he framed each day as a list he could work through. He did not pretend the past had been kinder than it was. He carried regrets without suffering them to swallow him. He wished he had drawn straighter lines around public employment. Treating government jobs as party assets kept streets tidy and services prompt, but it taught bad lessons about who owns a desk in a county office. He wished he had insisted on stricter boundaries for tolerated vice, because even managed indulgence invites exceptions and exceptions craft habits. He admitted those failings to friends who could hear them without turning them into headlines. They nodded, grateful that the man they had followed could speak about error in a voice that once only issued instructions. Visitors brought news that sounded like the first bars of a song he knew. Businesses along the boardwalk were fighting to keep lobbies bright. Motels at the edge of town did fine, especially with families who valued parking by the door. The big hotels tried to modernize, some succeeding, some fading. New Jersey politicians whispered a serious idea that had drifted across tables for years: legal gaming as a formal industry, not as a nightly exercise in looking the other way. The pitch was clean. Put the biggest vice in neon and tax it to fund schools, police, and public works. He had spent a lifetime managing the illegal version. He understood both the danger and the potential. He told visitors the same line each time. If the state chose that path, it had to do it in plain daylight with rules as clear as street signs, because corners and shadows are where rot lives longest. He would not live to see the decision, but he recognized the moment when a town considers whether to make a private bargain public. The nurses liked him. He remembered their names after one introduction, asked after a parent's surgery or a child's recital, and made them laugh by comparing hospital schedules to the hotel shifts he used to juggle. He never forgot that he was a patient now, not a patron. He thanked the housekeeper who dusted the edge of the radiator and the orderly who brought water at dawn. He had made a career by seeing everyone in a room. That habit never left him. It made the place feel kind even on days when stamina shortened and food tasted like ritual rather than pleasure. In early December, the air sharpened. Friends put on heavier coats before walking across the parking lot to see him. He tired more quickly. He still asked about bookings for the big hall, because holiday concerts mattered to the city's mood. He still asked about weekend occupancy. He still asked whether inspectors had a plan for the old wiring that made managers nervous in historic hotels when Christmas lights drew extra current. He folded the paper carefully after the sports pages and placed it on the chair next to him like an old friend. On a Monday in December 1968, his time ran out. The official notices said he died at the Atlantic County Convalescent Home in Northfield, 85 years old, a former sheriff and political leader whose federal conviction had ended a long run. The obituaries balanced words like ruler, boss, and czar with host, benefactor, and builder. They quoted detractors who said he treated public office as property, and admirers who said he kept the city safe for families. Both sides could point to facts. The paper printed the date he was born, the dates of his election as sheriff, the year of his conviction, the term he served, and the roles he held afterward as a civilian. The funeral drew a cross-section of the place he had shaped. Bellmen in good coats stood next to aldermen in dark suits. Old precinct captains whispered in pews, while a string of hotel managers filed in behind them. A judge who had sworn in ward leaders for decades kept his eyes on the floor. A handful of ministers remembered his holiday baskets to parishioners who had no coal. Reporters watched quietly, notebooks closed. Farley sat with the family, solemn and still. A red carnation lay on the casket, because there was no other flower that could sit there without pretending to be something else. The service was simple. No one lectured about right and wrong. The eulogies described a man who had turned a beach town into a convention city by insisting on delivery and discretion, and who had paid for his excesses with years and money and the permanent loss of a public role. They carried him to rest in Atlantic County soil. The wind off the ocean arrived as if invited. A handful of old-timers exchanged looks that said they had witnessed a chapter close. The city did not pause for long. It never had. Rooms still needed to be cleaned by noon. The morning train brought visitors who wanted lunch by the sea. A meeting about bridge repairs started on time. Election maps hung on walls in party offices even when no one was in the mood to study them. The habit of moving forward is how a resort survives winter. In the weeks that followed, newspapers ran features that tried to weigh his life without tipping the scale. They described how the machine under his hand had gathered money from nightlife operators and returned predictability in exchange. How public works passed through a filter that skimmed fees for the party and its leadership. How elections were engineered through service, pressure, and control over the tally. How city employees were expected to share wages with the organization. How he had met national figures in the suites of grand hotels and arranged hospitality in exchange for attention paid to Atlantic City's needs. They reminded readers that the charges that stuck were federal tax counts, not bootlegging or assault, because arithmetic is the lever investigators prefer. They noted that after imprisonment he had worked, legally as a salesman and representative, a life he lived without complaint. They also printed memories from people who had known him in ordinary moments. A waitress told of the time he quietly paid for a table of conventioneers when their card was declined and then left without introducing himself. A janitor at Convention Hall remembered him shaking his hand after a long night while everyone else ignored the crew. A school teacher recalled turkeys that showed up on porches without a name attached, only to find out years later where they had come from. Those anecdotes never erased the record of his crimes. They complicated the portrait, which is what testimonies from a community often do. Legacy moved in two lines. One line ran along the boardwalk and through government offices, an understanding that service, polish, and safety keep a resort alive, and that a central organizer can make disparate parts work together. The other line ran through council chambers, courtrooms, and classrooms as a warning. When an organizer treats public authority as inventory, corruption becomes routine, and trust erodes even if streets look clean. He embodied both lessons. The city had to absorb both without pretending one canceled the other. History gave him the odd fate of being remembered twice. Once as himself in the records and local memory, and again as a character with another surname in a fictionalized version seen by millions. The second telling added glamour and violence that fit a television arc better than a ledger book. People who had known him smiled at the differences. They said the real man wielded charm rather than blood, negotiations rather than shootouts, and that his undoing arrived as a stack of forms rather than a bullet. If any visitor asked which version to believe, the answer was simple. Read the tax case and look at convention schedules. Those two documents explain more than any screenplay. The county moved on in the way institutions do. Farley kept the machine humming into the next decade. New projects found funding. The expressway and parkway accomplished what they were meant to do. The big hall continued to host shows and rallies. A statewide vote in the mid-70s finally put blackjack and roulette under statutes, pairing them with regulations and inspectors who carried binders, not envelopes. That change landed after Johnson's time, but it answered a question he had heard whispered across tables near windows that faced the sea. The town had chosen daylight. It would spend decades learning whether that choice fixed old problems or simply gave them new names. For people who care about cause and effect, his story offers a set of clear points. He rose by mastering the mechanics of a county, and by understanding that favors, when distributed with flair and discipline, turn into votes. He kept a resort's economy thriving during a national ban by selling tolerance with rules that discouraged chaos. He converted public contracts into a funding stream for the organization. He wrapped all of it in hospitality, making the town seem safer than similar playgrounds elsewhere. The crimes were not mysteries. They were policies that violated the law. Bribery, extortion through licensing, bid collusion, the orchestration of elections, the sale of protection to illicit enterprises, and tax evasion. He fell because the federal government proved that his declared income could not support his visible spending. He returned from prison and lived within the law, working ordinary jobs and performing quiet acts of charity. He died with his reputation divided and his city still standing. For the town, the enduring lesson carried the simplicity of a trade. Order and spectacle are worth little if they are purchased by training a government to sell its duties. In the short term, that bargain can look brilliant. In the long term, it costs more than it pays, because it weakens the trust that keeps a tourist happy and a voter patient. Johnson had built a system that many citizens tolerated because it made their lives feel secure and prosperous. When the reckoning came, They also had to admit that the line between hospitality and corruption had been crossed too often. The generation that followed had to relearn how to keep streets clean without envelopes, how to award contracts without percentages, and how to count ballots without choreography. The last pieces of him that remained in public view were modest. A photograph in a lobby display about the city's past, a file in the county archives, stories that older bellmen told younger ones on slow afternoons. People walking past those pictures thought of a time when a man in a good suit could turn a beach town into a national brand. They thought of a red carnation in a lapel, and a smile that made problems evaporate. They thought, if they had read far enough, about a courtroom where smiles matter less than math, he would have approved of the city's instinct to keep working, to keep greeting trains, to keep sweeping the boards at dawn no matter what yesterday's headlines had said. He had believed from the start that a resort lives or dies by its ability to make strangers feel welcome. That belief had fueled his best acts and excused his worst. He learned late, but clearly, that a welcome built on lawful service lasts longer than one built on quiet bargains. It is a simple sentence, earned the hard way. The ocean kept its own counsel. Waves threw themselves at the sand with the same energy as the day he had first walked the planks as a boy. Lights came on each evening, tracing the curve of the shore. Musicians tuned up in rooms he had helped fill. A new generation argued in council chambers about budgets and permits and festival dates. The files about him remained where they belonged, in drawers and archives. A record of a man who had been decisive, generous, calculating, and finally, accountable. He had shaped a place and been shaped by it. He had left marks that could be measured in concrete and in customs, in stories told softly and in numbers stamped on court papers. In the end, the town he had loved did what it always did. It put on a show, kept order, and met the morning with work to do. And that brings us to the end of tonight's story from the Silent Empires. Nucky Johnson here, thanking you for joining me on this quiet walk through ambition, power, and the rise of Atlantic City's golden age. If this story helped you relax or drift into the night, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and join our family for more stories of gangsters and forgotten empires. Over 90% of our viewers watch, but haven't subscribed yet. So if you enjoyed this one, your support truly helps us keep these powerful stories alive. Share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories reach. Until next time, may the silence of the empire rest over you, and may the echoes of history carry you gently into sleep. Good night.